So, will we see Tropical Storm Barry form within the next few days, or should I say within the next 48 to 72 hours, because that's the current time frame of when this storm system will develop? Well, it depends, and if we were to take a look at the structure right now, it's not looking very good, but it could change by the time we approach the Gulf of Mexico once the wind shear begins to wind down and this gets a little bit more time over the warm Gulf of Mexico waters. Let me show you guys a GFS model to really show you the possibility of this developing. Taking a look at the current GFS model's forecast, we see that we have a broad area of moisture right over Central America. Now, this isn't very conducive for tropical cyclone development because that means that there's a large amount of vorticity that's very spread out. So it's going to be a lot more difficult for one central area of lower pressure to really strengthen when it's fighting with all these other thunder showers that are just to the outside of this very broad storm system. For a tropical cyclone to develop, it needs to be a bit more compact, but the GFS model does expect that to happen by the time we approach a Saturday time frame. The key question is, will it be enough? Because the key thing that is going to affect this storm system's intensity is how much interaction with land it's going to deal with. And as of right now, it seems like both the GFS and the European model are not expecting this area of low pressure to stay over water for a very prolonged period of time. So the only ways this could strengthen into a tropical storm is if we see rapid intensification where this broad area of moisture is able to really develop one small center of circulation right over the southern Gulf of Mexico, which, depending on how this moisture or how this convective activity plays out over Central America, very well could happen if we do see an enhancement of convective activity right over the southern Gulf of Mexico. But it's going to be a little bit more difficult when it's let over water for a small period of time, like I just mentioned. And the other way it could strengthen into a tropical storm is if we see a track a little bit further northward that would allow this center of circulation to have just a bit more time over water, because there is a big difference in terms of how much time it'll have over water if it were to take a track that's pretty much due west rather than due northwest, where it'll have much more time over the warm southern Gulf of Mexico water. So that's going to be a key thing we're going to need to pay very close attention to. As of right now, the GFS model does develop a small center of circulation, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily tropical storm strength, as there's just a little bit the area of moisture is just a little bit too broad, and it won't help that we are expected to see a tropical cyclone develop just to the south of this potential low pressure system, which should take a lot of the vorticity away from this center of circulation. So it does make it a little bit less likely we're going to see this develop into a tropical storm, but certainly not impossible. Another thing that could be a pretty big detriment is the wind shear, because as of right now, it's dealing with quite a bit of wind shear. There is a small upper level low located right over Florida that's bringing a stronger amount of upper level winds. However, it is expected to weaken. The GFS model is a little bit more aggressive within wind shear, while if you were to take a look at the European model, it's a little bit less aggressive because it expects this upper level low that was located over Florida to be a little bit weaker, which means that the wind shear will be weaker, and it could have a little bit of an opening to where it could intensify. But again, the amount of time it'll have over water really isn't in its favor, but definitely still pay close attention, because regardless of whether this develops into a tropical storm or not, you still should expect very heavy rainfall right over Mexico, and we could even see that rainfall move as far north as Texas. If we were to take a look at the total accumulated rainfall forecast, we see that over the next few days we should see well over 2 inches of rain for much of southern Mexico. So definitely be prepared for that over the next few days, as even if this were to develop into a tropical storm, the biggest threat would be rainfall, because this likely won't be a strong tropical storm if it were to intensify. So we wouldn't see much impacts when it comes to wind or even storm surge with the storm system that weak. but it's something you want to keep in mind when it comes to rainfall more specifically, and you can't underestimate that because the leading cause of tropical cyclone related deaths throughout the world is not due to storm surge, it's not due to wind, it's due to flooding that's induced by heavy rainfall. So especially in the higher elevations of Mexico, you need to prepare accordingly for this, and don't underestimate it just because it won't necessarily develop into a tropical storm. But continuing to move forward, we do see some of that rain move into southern Texas. It won't be much, so which is good news, but be aware of that going into early next week for those areas. And you might be wondering, what are the chances that this storm system takes a track a little bit further northward to strengthen a bit more than usual? Well, if we were to take a look at the GFS ensemble members, it does seem like there's a broad area regarding the projected path in which this low pressure system could go, as most of the ensemble members are in pretty good agreement that this should stay as far south as you can pretty much ask for when it comes to a tropical cyclone moving into the Gulf of Mexico, which is certainly good news because it won't strengthen as much. So that's definitely something we want to see, and the European model is also showing a fairly similar forecast. So if we were to take a quick look at that, so let's take a look at this computer model run. So updating the plot, we see that this is also in fairly good agreement, a little bit further northward than the GFS model, which is very interesting. And we do see that one ensemble member strengthen a little bit more to where maybe this has a chance at becoming a tropical storm. But at this point, it seems like the ridging is just a little bit too strong right over the southeast, so that will keep this storm system further southward and not really have much of an opening to move further northward and have more time over water. So most likely, this should remain just below tropical storm status, but you still need to be prepared for that possibility. It could develop into a tropical storm because the water is so warm. The wind shear could be lighter by the time it approaches the Gulf of Mexico, and there's plenty of moisture for this center of circulation to work with by the time it approaches the Gulf of Mexico. In terms of the National Hurricane Center's current forecast, when it comes to a probability this develops, it's still at a low 10% chance and a low 20% chance within the next 7 days. However, this is 20% more than it was just a few hours ago. So maybe if the National Hurricane Center continues to see the trend from the computer models where the computer models do show a trend of a little bit more confidence in a center of circulation developing in the southern Gulf of Mexico, we still could very well see this chance increase over the next few hours and potentially the next day or two, depending on if that trend continues. It still seems unlikely for that to continue, especially since there isn't really a large amount of uncertainty when we're talking about a forecast that's around 3 days out, which this tropical storm system would be by the time it approaches the Gulf of Mexico. So, but still, you want to be aware of that possibility because we already have a higher chance than, like I said, the day before. So who's to say that we could see that chance rise once again? But most likely, the chance should be low for tropical cyclone formation. Now, for anything in the long-term future that could maybe pose a threat when it comes to tropical cyclone development, based on what the computer models are stating and based on what the Global Tropics Hazards Outlook is stating, which I'll show you right now, we see that things are expected to be quiet over much of the tropical Atlantic, even as we approach as late as middle July. And the big reason is that we're expecting to see a large amount of ridging build right over the northern Atlantic. I know that's very that isn't this. I wouldn't call it that, but relative to the North Atlantic, the Southern Atlantic is expected to be drier than normal. So that should suppress tropical cyclone activity over potentially even the next few weeks beyond the potential of Tropical Storm Barry over the Gulf of Mexico, as there's just going to be a lot of dry air forming right over the main development region and into much of the Caribbean thanks to a strong amount of ridging. And it could also be contributed by the fact that the sea surface temperatures over those areas are cooler than normal, so that promotes more of a sinking motion that's going to prevent any convective activity really from having a good possibility of strengthening to the point where we would see a tropical cyclone. And showing an example of this is taking a look straight from the European model scenario. Really, the only areas of moisture which could be interesting is right in the extreme southern portion of the Caribbean. But typically speaking, it's fairly rare for much low pressure systems to develop into a tropical storm this far southward, mainly because the wind shear tends to be a lot stronger in the extreme southern portions of the Caribbean. And plus, for these low pressure systems, they won't have a lot of time over water. And of course, since we're still relatively early in the hurricane season, the wind shear is going to be stronger. So it's going to be very difficult, even with these areas of convective activity in the southern Caribbean, to develop into much of anything really. But I'll keep you guys updated if anything changes, because of course the hurricane season is very unpredictable. But as of right now, it seems like there's going to be a little bit too much dry air and a bit too much wind shear over much of the Atlantic for much of anything to form, at least within the next few days and likely the next potentially few weeks. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more hurricane season updates, as well as winter weather updates as we get closer and closer to the winter of 2025 and 2026. And I hope you guys all have a great day.